Hello, and welcome to Synthesized Sunsets. Today, we are here with Cairo Smith, who is an essayist, novelist, director, and editor who runs the outlet Futurist Letters. Today, we're here primarily to discuss two of his novels, Komodo, a sci-fi adventure in which the author tries to raise venture capital for a sort of like paramilitary startup, and Scenebux, which is a near-future sci-fi adjacent novel in which the cynical main character takes a surreal trip around the globe through various very online subcultural scenes. So we're so glad to have you on the show. And to start things off, could you describe what a subcultural scene is in your mind and how it relates to your novel?
This is a very interesting question. I think subcultural scenes perhaps were the default mode of existence prior to mass media, just because the physical limitations of getting information around the world meant that, any small town, any church, any group of people who aren't really traveling is going to have its own set of cultural modes, traditions, weird festivals and in jokes, and they're going to have this sort of insular quality, just geographically and temporally. And then with the advent of mass media, printing press, television, radio, etc., you get this macro culture. Subculture is basically people who are, in my mind, somewhat deliberately eschewing the macro culture for any reason and cloistering themselves in this occult or even just sort of friendly and secretive way, either around a common interest, a common ideology, a common prior life experience, or anything like that. And then these subcultures, they end up getting sucked up into the macro culture, anything from punk rock, greasers, etc. And if they get big enough, then they get absorbed into the macro. So it's sort of this early stage of culture where it hasn't yet either died or become ubiquitous.
I was wondering, like, how did you originally get into some of the scenes that are present in Scenebux? And if you could talk a little bit about what they're like.
Yeah, I don't really know. Obviously, Twitter is kind of the font of all this. For a long time, actually, I was very scared of Twitter. Twitter to me was
Reasonable.
associated with this sort of very mean and glib language of people who were aloof and artsy. And this was sort of in the progressive heyday of Twitter. And people I knew who were, making their names as mini influencers or posting these random absurd satirical things. There was a part of my brain that just didn't really know how to speak that language. And so I've had a Twitter for 11 years, but I think I only posted for the first time 3 years ago, meaningfully. I think what dipped my toes in was I was working in Hollywood and I got hired to be the head of marketing for a crypto startup. And obviously, when you are doing marketing for a startup, you've got to meet the audience where they are. And so, regardless of my interest or lack of interest in crypto on its own face, I said, okay, I'm going in. I'm going to go to the events. I'm going to speak the language. I'm going to run the Twitter. I think I got it up to 40 or 50,000 followers in half a year just by sort of posting and getting a brand vision that made sense. And when you're posting on crypto Twitter, you end up seeing all these adjacent tech, etc. subcultures. And so I think that's what first put it on my radar. I was at the same time starting my Hollywood career, and starting to get opportunities and seeing what I found was just basically an appalling process of trying to rank people's worth based on their privilege or lack thereof, which it sounds jokey now, but at the time it was very, very serious. And I just found this so antithetical to my sensibilities. And Twitter, sort of in that turnover into the Musk era, was pretty much the only place where people were actually talking about how ridiculous this was. So I think from there, I just sort of got sucked in all the way.
What was obviously cool about Scenebux is that when you're in this tech Twitter slop world, like there's something about reading it in like an actual novel. I think that there were some scenes in Scenebux that I had maybe seen in something like an Astral Codex 10 post, or even like just a bit of a longer Twitter post, but to see it in like an actual novel, I would just be like, huh, this is like a book, you know? It came out of the internet, and now it's here, and this is very strange. So I definitely appreciate that, especially because like for like the East Coast and the more like New York City MFA, or even the sort of like alt lit scene in New York, there's almost like overrepresentation. You know, like if you look at what's being published by Big Five, it's pretty easy to find people talking about like, you know, um, like stuff in NYC basically. But I
Yeah.
feel like for like, you know, West Coast stuff, there's not as much, and there's kind of a lot there. You know, there's a lot to write about, as you can see in the novel. And I think that also it's kind of rare to get a like a novel from the perspective of someone who is so young. You know, like the protagonist of Scenebux is only 1 year older than both of us. And I think that probably most of the people who have been talking about Scenebux are like somewhat older than the protagonist, and they're just like, you know, I don't know if like a young person can speak to this. But I did say that it felt reasonably true. I remember I was like sort of convinced that you would be about the age of the protagonist. I didn't know how old you were when you wrote the book. I mean, honestly, I would say the protagonist is kind of like a lot cooler than I would expect the average member of our cohort to be. But yeah, I definitely didn't feel like. I remember I saw some review of it that was sort of speculating that like, oh, maybe this is just how like, you know, Zillennials and millennials think that think that Gen Z people are. But I don't know. It felt pretty true to me, I suppose. So
Really?
you can say that much.
That's interesting. I react with surprise because I try, as I've said sometimes, I try not to read reviews just
uh,
because I don't know. I guess I'm a sensitive young man, but also I don't want this sort of like recursive effect where I'm like overfitting to feedback. I don't want to be like reinforcement learning myself off
right, right,
reviews.
right.
Um, so you know,
Well,
if I occasionally
I
encounter
wouldn't say
something,
that I wouldn't say that they weren't really making the claim that this is what they weren't making the claim that you were doing this. They were just kind of speculating, like, well, I'm not a young person, so I don't know.
I see, I see,
So
I see.
yeah, so they were more just like, I don't know. Maybe it was. I think it was kind of open ended at the end. They're just like, well, I don't know. Like maybe some non-existent like young person in the audience can like comment on the accuracy of this, and I was just like,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Ben, the character, he's 25 in the book. I was 25 when I started outlining the book, um, sort of from that milieu. And you know, originally I was sort of basing it around tail end COVID events, meaning 2022. And then by the time I actually got to writing it, which was earlier this year, I was 27, and I thought, you know, I actually think this works better in 2025, post Trump 2. It sort of fits more with the current zeitgeist. So that's how it all fit together there.
yeah,
Yeah,
I
I
think so.
mean, it was crazy just reading this book. I read it like last week, and like the book takes place this year, basically along the same time period that the Papal Conclave took place, which is like April to May this year, I think, or something. And I mean, 25. The main character is 25. And this is just like the first time I've ever read a published book that was like this contemporary. And I mean, that's partially just because it was self-published, right? Like I think if you were to go a traditional publishing route, like there's kind of no hope you could get a book published that's like taking place using events from the same year when you get it published. I was thinking that might actually be a potential advantage of self-publishing. A lot of like contemporary books tend to do this thing where they are sort of like they're a bit timeless. They don't reference any actual events, like they take place in the present day, but not exactly. And if you're able to write fast and publish quickly, it's definitely very cool to be able to read a book that was published in the same year.
Thank you. Yeah, you sort of need to flex your comparative advantages when you're a little guy. You need to operate in domains where the big players can't go. So obviously, if the big players have huge marketing budgets, but they also have a 2 to 3 year lead time, you know, you just need to be running circles around them on pace, and being able to speak to the moment. Now, I do want to shout out New Ritual Press, who published this book. All the terms, self-published, independently published, it gets a little semantic, but technically this was a small press book. Matt Pegas and Dan Baltic did a lot of great work on it, and Lydia at Vera did a lot of great work getting the review copies out. So it was certainly on this one more than just me, start to finish putting it together. It really was a team effort.
This is kind of a weird comparison to make, but I feel like there were some striking similarities to what you were saying and what Ken Liu said on our podcast, who's a reasonably well-known sci-fi author. And he was saying that he's just kind of consistently annoyed by the fact that contemporary fiction tries to situate itself in some sort of weird pre-internet time where it's just like they kind of intentionally induce they make it more unrealistic to kind of be able to pass it off as realism when the real realism would be where you have the phones and the internet. And so he was saying that his book feels kind of sci-fi, but that's not really his intention. He doesn't consider it to be a sci-fi novel, and what he's actually trying to do is have it be an accurate representation of the present, sort of, which is going to feel kind of sci-fi. And yeah, no, I think that's true now. Sometimes it's not even in a novel, but I'll just be walking around, and it'll just feel like a very sci-fi environment, and I'm kind of curious how long that is going to take to percolate down into mainstream publishing.
Yeah, I think when someone is afraid of including something like a text conversation or any use of technology in a novel because they want it to have a literary weight, it means they're taking the wrong lessons from the things they grew up reading. Just because you read F. Scott Fitzgerald and he doesn't have texting doesn't mean that you are moving away from the American modernist literary tradition when someone texts. I mean, the telephone in that day was a very contemporary technology, and people were writing all about the telephone in their books. You need to paint a picture of life as it is, and you can do that in a stately way. It doesn't automatically make it brain rotted or wherever people go with their fear. That's strongly my feeling.
Mm-hmm. Would you say there are certain things that are certain things that you do to try to make more contemporary feeling fiction seem less brain rotted while still feeling true?
The fun thing with Scenebux is I just absolutely let it rip.
Yeah.
There was a more constrained version of the novel, and then when I knew that I was going to be writing it for New Ritual, and I knew that they had this sort of tolerance for for lack of a better word, shitposty fiction, I said, you know what? I'm just gonna take this to the max. I actually have to give some credit to Worst Boyfriend Ever. I think he, and then also Adam Lowe's Reinspecs with the mixtape Hyperborea, kind of showed me the young male voice that you can bring to work. And so the version of Ben that ended up in Scenebux is way more of a dirtbag than I am, but it was fun getting to explore that. It felt like a niche that needed to be scratched in fiction, and it was also cool for me to just try something new.
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel this way too. I haven't actually published any fiction, but I've certainly been writing a lot of it in the background. And there are a couple times where I'm just you know what, I'm just gonna send this one. There's just some extremely long brain rotted conversation where they're talking about some startup or something, and I'm just yeah, feels pretty. It's kind of like a pressure release valve. Yeah, no, actually.
So again, it's comparative advantage. People want something that feels real.
And that's kind of a thing that I haven't resolved yet when it comes to writing fiction is I think that writing these more brain rotting passages, I kind of felt I was also rotting my own brain a bit more as a result of getting in the headspace of this character. And so I was okay, should I keep doing this? But at the same time, I feel when I tried to write in a different register, it just didn't have the sauce. And so I was wondering, okay, so do I just kind of take the L for the art, or do I try to write in a different register that's maybe more well-adjusted? And I've kind of been leaning towards the first thing.
Yeah, I think that you, at a certain point, that's what you need to do as an artist, is sacrifice your mental health for the sake of what you put out. That's kind of what people show up for. You know, it's
Uh-huh.
like you don't show up to see someone do like evil Knievel tricks and magician's tricks like with a bunch of safety nets. Or like even if there is a safety net, people don't want to see it. People want to see you like risking it for the biscuit. So I think it's
Mhm.
similar with authors as far as our sanity.
There's been only like one complete work of fiction that I wrote, which was like a short story. And I didn't publish anywhere yet, but I remember like I was a little bit bothered by the degree to which I was actually able to like manifest things in real life, or that they kind of just happened. So basically, in the story, it's the premise is that like I kind of just like split into two people, kind of like inexplicably, and like the two copies of me like flip a coin to decide like who gets to be the real one. And so the real one gets to resume like their life as me, whereas the other one just kind of has to like go to China, figure
I'm
out what
already
their
very
new
hooked.
identity is going to be. And at the time, I was like not interested in China really, like maybe a little bit, but like definitely not to a very deep extent. But like I ended up going down this very long internet rabbit hole to induce more
Uh-huh.
realism, and like by the end of it, I was just like learning Chinese, like hardcore. Like I was like studying Chinese a lot and like learning about like Chinese tech and stuff like that. And then I actually ended up like in China, like 3 months after writing this, like despite having like no intention of going there before writing the story. And like also just some of the things that happened in the story did kind of like end up happening in my life. And like I wasn't ever like, oh, I'm gonna like manifest this. Like that was never my intention with writing the story, but like it did kind of happen like that. And so it was kind of cool, but at the same time, I'm just like, man, like maybe I gotta be kind of careful about what I write. So I was wondering like to what extent the stuff that you write ends up like serendipitously like happening in your own life.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that someone said that all good fiction is in some way prescient or predictive. I think that we are pretty much always aware of things in our subconscious before we're aware of them in our conscious. Sometimes that's a question of a second or two, sometimes that's a question of years. And I think when you are writing or doing any kind of art that really taps yourself, you're sort of creating a pipeline straight through to the page from your subconscious. A lot of what you pull out of that is stuff that you are not aware of that ends up either, like in the zeitgeist overall or in your personal life floating to the surface after you write it. So what you described makes complete sense to me.
I think one thing I've kind of gotten into like reading more Substack, especially the kind of like more niche like subcultural Substacks, is that whenever you're kind of like pondering something by yourself, I think there are times where you kind of just like, I'm the only one thinking about this, or like I'm the only one like considering this one thing like very deeply. But then you can go on the internet and sort of find out that like a lot of other people are in fact like thinking about this thing. This could be discouraging, like you don't get to feel like a special snowflake. But I think another way to think about it is like I think it does feel really cool to be working through the same ideas as like a bunch of people like all at the same time, but like independently. Like it's not that you're like talking about these ideas in like a scene necessarily, but more there's the idea that like all of you are kind of going through this independent experience of working through these ideas, and it's just like exciting to see what pops out of that. You know, like sometimes I am just like,
Yeah.
like I can tell this person was thinking the same thing as me like 2 years ago, and they were definitely not thinking that I was thinking this thing, and I was not thinking they were. Does that make sense? Like I feel like this is kind of cool.
Yeah, it does. There are these waves, and sometimes we sort of take little fragments and run with them, and it turns out someone else did the same thing. My most recent novel, Current Affairs, which follows a guy who works in marketing and works in political campaigns and various things like that. He, at one point, is basically tasked with coming up with a PR campaign for a state measure to upzone residential neighborhoods. When I started writing this, and actually in some early drafts, the campaign that he ends up coming up with was called Abundance. And then obviously,
That's
um,
crazy.
I was not aware of the Thompson and Klein book, but then that came out and Abundance was like all over the place. And I thought, okay, clearly someone else was on this idea. I think I need to change the name. But yeah, I'm just glad that didn't happen like right after publication because it would have been a little annoying. But the fact that it came out before, I was just like, okay, I see where we're all going with this. It felt good. It felt like it meant that I had been listening to the zeitgeist.
I think it imposes an interesting sort of urgency onto the artist. Because if you do think this, like if you do think that everyone is kind of thinking around similar ideas, there's a much more of an incentive to like get it out, before someone else does it. I remember there was a pretty interesting interview with Cixin Liu, the Three Body Problem author, where he was talking about the writing of Death's End, which is like the longest book and considered to be like sort of the most unwieldy, but also the most awesome. And when he was talking about writing the novel, he actually said that he published it in a much narrower amount of time than he ideally would have liked to, because he thought that there was a chance every year that the zeitgeist wouldn't be right to publish it anymore. And I thought that was kind of an interesting perspective, because I feel like normally it's just like, oh, great works, they kind of got to like take their time, you got to like sit on it for the necessary amount of time. You're just like, nah, I just like ripped through this novel. I wrote it in like less than a year because it just had to be done. And he was saying, I mean, he actually said explicitly that China is not always so hospitable to publishing science fiction. He was saying like in the course of Chinese history, there's kind of been like rises and falls, and as in terms of like how much the government is willing to let stuff come out and how willing people are to read it. And that's kind of more structural than what we're talking about. But I definitely think it's related. Like there can be like a sort of urgency to publishing stuff that's really like on the edge before it seems like derivative. To return the novel a little bit, there's part of the novel where they go to a sort of like San Francisco summer camp type thing. And I remember Gordon was wondering if this was based on Vibecamp. Well, I guess first of all, like, would you say this is true? But I guess we may also want to introduce what Vibecamp is to our listeners after this.
I think that you guys would probably be better equipped to say what Vibecamp is, because I have not been, and it seems like you have. So if you want to start with an explanation, maybe that's the way to begin.
Sure. Yeah, how to describe Vibecamp? I would say Vibecamp, in my mind, is sort of the intersection point between like people who have spent a little bit too much time coding and like Burning Man. I would say your median Vibecamp attendees kind of like post a lot of things. Like they're like post software engineer. There might be like post having a job in general. There might be like post rationalist. But I think that like what kind of ties people together is they used to do a sort of like very disembodied cerebral sort of thing, and then they decided they wanted to like break with that way of being in some way. And so there were a lot of people who were doing this on Twitter, and they were just like, hey, what if we all met up and we went to this place called Vibecamp? We just like vibe. And I feel like the vibe has kind of lost a lot of its meaning in the past few years or so, but I think that to me, vibe was really kind of gesturing towards the fact that people are trying to like be connected to their bodies, but in like the most Silicon Valley brained way possible. Like I remember someone who's kind of like a quintessential member of this community to me is someone who like was like ex machine learning at Meta, and now they're just like this like highly specialized massage therapist who talks about like frolicking around in the woods, but also have crazy takes about like how to most efficiently do massage therapy. And so there are a lot of people like that. I mean, I will say that as for a lot of online things, like there's definitely a degree to which people at Vibecamp can pass as normal, especially individually. Like I think if you're to just read about Vibecamp on the internet, you're just like, oh yeah, this is like obviously going to be this crazy thing, and everyone's going to like look really weird. It's like, no, I think honestly, like a good amount of the attendees would seem pretty normal in isolation, but like when you get them all together, sometimes like bizarre things happen.
You also, I think there's a little bit of like a power of suggestion, or like a
right
fulfillment type thing, where like if the top-down culture is saying like be weird, people are gonna like perform weird, even if they can also perform normal. To answer your question in brief, I mean, yes, obviously. In the book, there's an event called Edgelands, which is kind of a quadruple entendre, I guess, and there are a lot of those like triple and quadruple entendres in the book. Obviously, there's like Edgelands takes place at a place loosely based on Camp Navarro, which is up in the Redwoods, which is not the same as Vibecamp, which I believe takes place in Maryland. I try to sort of anything that I'm riffing on loosely in Scenebux make it 1 or 2 degrees away. So it's not like a perfect one-to-one. I also, when I worked for Niantic Labs, we did events at Camp Navarro. So I felt like I could write the like climate and the flora and fauna of the Redwoods more plausibly than I could Maryland, where I haven't really spent time. There was also the thing of just it, it didn't really make sense to have Ben fly yet again. So it was a little better to place it a little closer to home, just story-wise. But yeah, Edgelands, I guess, quadruple entendre in the sense of, one being physically on the edge of the city, two being sort of at the fringes of the social scene, a subculture, as you say, three being full of people who are trying to be edgy, some more than others, and then four, obviously, like edging in like the gooning brain rot sense, which is pretty characteristic of how most things are like some sort of sexual pun in the book. That's just sort of the pinch-in element. But yeah, it's not a secret. If you look at the end of the book, one of the people, anyone who's a public figure whose ideas I sort of riffed on, I tried to include in the afterword, including Brooke Bowman, who's one of the co-founders of Vibecamp. And she actually, because Twitter's a small world, somehow became aware of the book and posted that she was reading it. And I had this little bit of, oh boy. And then she messaged me. And Brooke, she's a very sweet person. She said, hey, I read Scenebux. Honestly, I was a little nervous to get to the Vibecamp portion because I wasn't sure, like, how you were going to portray us. But I actually felt like you captured it really well. Like, I was really flattered. It was cool she kind of said something similar to you guys where she was like, it's cool to see these things that I'm familiar with depicted in, like, a literary way. It's just a little novel. Pun not intended. But... yeah, and then she ended up saying, like, hey, do you want to come out to Vibecamp? Like, do you want to meet everybody? Like, it was a very warm reaction, which I guess I'd be grateful for. I know there are some other people alluded to, as far as their ideas and their work in Scenebux, who would not be so pleased with how they're portrayed. But it just is what it is. So yes, is the short answer to that question.
That list of names at the end of the Scenebux book was so entertaining to read, and I was pretty depressed of like knowing the majority of these. I'm like, why do I know who all these people are? Like, I should not.
I mean, as I said at the end, it's partially a key, for people. I can't even imagine trying to decipher this book like 40 years in the future, but
yeah, it feels ridiculous.
Maybe it'll be a jumping off point. But yeah, for me, obviously, it's like I know all these people, and for many people who read it, at least a few people, including Brooke, have read it because someone told them their name is at the end, which I guess also makes it into a marketing strategy.
Yeah.
I will say that one way in which I don't remember it feeling as similar to Vibecamp is I think that in Vibecamp, and this kind of surprised me too, is like people were like really into math in a way I was like not expecting. Just for the record, like I'm a math major. I feel like I was one of the worst people at math that I met at Vibecamp. In fact, I was probably the worst at math in my little trio, myself, Gordon, and Merrick, who are not even like that high up in the like interested in math. But like, I feel like I would just often be in these conversations where they would just like immediately go somewhere like extremely mathematical in like a way that I was not expecting. Like, I remember there was this one time where we were at this demo for Smells. There's this guy who was part of what was called the Qualia Research Institute, which is this like organization that tries to study like the subjective phenomenological experiences of the senses and like are there things about the senses that can't be reduced down to, stuff like that. And his whole thing was he was giving a talk about smell and like some interesting properties of smell that you might not think about. And one of the things he was talking about was like, what was it, like ways you can move the inside of your nose to like change the direction that you're perceiving the smell coming from? Was that what it was?
Yeah, but yeah, we just use all these phrases like, think of this as like a projection onto the vector space, like represented by the. It was just like all these insanely.
But yeah, I remember there's
a lot of that comes down to just like me being a word cell, and also my entry into Teapot being through like a crypto startup, which is like basically 8th grade math, like you're just doing like bonding curves on a plane. So yeah, I think the other reason though, like within the novel, it's not the general Edgelands population that Ben is spending time with. It's this like goth crypto fascist element. And I feel like if society has shown us anything, fascists are by and large like word cells and failed artists themselves. So I feel like there's less of a math element in that subculture than in the broader subculture.
Yeah, no, certainly. And I don't think the novel suffers for it. I mean, I think the novel's
Sure.
probably
No,
actually
that's
better
interesting
off
to
not
note.
having the like in-depth topology conversations. I remember like I was in this conversation. So first of all, there was like this pretty memorable moment where we were like sitting around talking about smells, and then there was this guy that like raised his hand to kind of just make this general observation, and in the smell workshop, and he was just like, the smell is so intense. I feel like it's just expanding to fill my entire consciousness. And the smell guy, who is just this very kind of like British, almost like English coded guy. I don't know how to describe him, but he was just kind of like, would you say that the smell is so intense that it expands in dimensionality to fill your entire consciousness? Or would you say that your consciousness is being projected down onto the lower dimensionality of sense space? And the guy was like, I don't know. And then he was
Sure.
like, would you say the smell was so intense that are you unable to perceive its dimensionality? And the guy was like, I guess so.
You know, these things, they need to be immortalized. Like, it can't just be me. There need to be other people going to events like Vibecamp and like coming away writing pieces of literature that stand the test of time. It's important, you know? Like, you can read about all these like crazy mushroom and acid trippers in the 60s and 70s. Like, you know, they were vain enough to write their books about their subcultures, you know? Like, we need to be doing that too. That's my feeling. Speaking of subculture, people use jargon as a decentralized defense against the dilution or the spread of a subculture. You know, like when you start using math terms in there, like in a colloquial sense, you're like creating like a vaguely math shaped like barrier to entry, you know, or at least like people need to lurk enough to figure it out. Kind of like how, you know, Finnish culture would be a lot more diluted if they had started speaking like Russian or Swedish, you know?
Right.
Like,
Uh-huh.
I think these jargon things, they do serve like a, funny enough, an antimemetic purpose as far as like keeping the conversation contained to the in-group.
To switch gears a bit, we wanted to talk about your film, Red Team, and just your general experience of being like an independent filmmaker. So, just for context, I would say Red Team is kind of like a realization of a certain part of the internet's worst fears, where there is some startup that's purpose is to red team an AI startup or AI startups and basically try to figure out if they can make an AI do really evil stuff so that the AI knows how to make it not do really evil stuff. You know, kind of like the cybersecurity people of today. But this ends up going horribly wrong, and the AI actually escapes containment from the simulation box. I was wondering, like, who was your intended target audience for this? Like, is it more people in the Bay Area who kind of know what the vibe is, or is it people who haven't heard of these ideas? Or I was just curious about that.
Yeah, I think that this came out of, as I said, I worked at a startup for a couple of years. I think that I wrote Red Team shortly after leaving. So, you know, in some ways it's a reflection on all that. And there is like a broader startup culture that is similar, even if it's physically outside the Bay. I also just find LLMs fascinating. I wouldn't say I'm like a maximalist on like use cases, especially for art. I don't think anyone who's like a committed artist is really like a fully replace us all AI maximalist. But you know, these are tools that I find endlessly interesting. So, audience, honestly, the short answer is there's no audience. I just made it for me based on what I'm interested in. And when you're putting your own money into a project, you're allowed to make whatever you want. So, I just had this idea and I thought, hey, that would be cool. And I think we could shoot it for kind of cheap. I pitched it to my other half, who's also my producing partner, and she said it was a great script, and she's not in that scene. So the fact that she liked it, even like being an outsider, kind of convinced me. Okay, let's go ahead and do it.
I honestly feel like you could have gotten a lot of money from the rationalists
Yeah, I
community to
keep waiting
produce
for
it,
like Yud to
which
watch
is pretty
it
funny.
and like
No,
get
like
the bump.
actually, because like well, not Yud, but like I think it's funny because people in the rationalist community, when they're just trying to decide like what to prioritize, like giving money for and stuff, a lot of the time will just be like, why are we wasting money on like the overhead for like this thing when really we could just be redirecting this money into like 1,000 more shrimp tasers or something like that. As a result, it's not as common, I think, for people to come out with rationalist art because they're just like, oh, I would rather just spend that money on shrimp tasers rather than making something that like may or may not be good. But like, I think that the rationalist community, I think, has actually really suffered from this because they just don't. They have very good propaganda for people who have kind of like a similar way of thinking about things. You know, like Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality is a very good piece of
I still
propaganda
haven't
for
read it.
like,
I'm fascinated. It's on my list.
teenagers who are good at math. But in terms of like appealing to the general populace, it's like, they just really kind of suffer from having these kind of glossier like ways to present themselves to the public and just come across like really really weird. I mean, I think that what was it? If you build this,
If anyone builds it, everyone dies.
yeah, everyone dies. Like I would say this is kind of the first, like, I don't know if you would call it art, but just like more public facing statement that the community made that was consumed by normies. And like, I mean, the people who made it, they're certainly not like artists by trade, and they're not like that kind of propagandist. And so I think that especially the pre-SBF era, there was definitely kind of growing awareness of like, okay, we can't just like buy more shrimp tasers and like Miri researchers. Like we also need to like, figure out how to get our message out. So all this to say, like, I think if you did put up like a post on like EA forum and just being like, hey, would anyone like fund this project? I feel like there's a chance you could have just got a ton of money. Like, I don't know.
Well,
Depends.
they say a short is a proof of concept for a feature. So maybe it actually makes the pitch stronger. You go, hey, look what we did, but nobody watches short films, so you just put on your rationalist hat and you go ask for a little money. Actually, you take off your hat and you hold it out and you ask for crypto. And
Yeah.
I feel like I owe you some sort of finder's fee if that ends up working. So I'll let you guys know. But
you get your
I would
dusty
say I'm
Musk and it's
probably
fun.
not as much of an AI doomer as you would think like the author of the movie is from watching it. I definitely think like AI doom is like within the spread of possibilities, but I'm just like not existential about it.
I think that increasingly a lot of people who would have been novelists in another era have gone into screenwriting because it's just sort of like there's a much more likely chance that what you write is going to be culturally impactful, and it is kind of like the dominant mode of storytelling in our era. And what's interesting to me is that like you do both things, right? Like you direct movies, you're involved in Hollywood, but then you also write novels. How do you see novels and TV and film kind of like slotting against each other? Like, do you think there are things that do you think you really try to lean into the medium because you do both, or is it more just kind of like, oh well, I like novels and I also like making films?
This is a good question. I was certainly writing prose fiction before I was writing screenplays, so I don't see novels as something that I sort of went into after, even though my major was screenwriting. I think that a motion picture, specifically in the theater, is the most impactful medium that we've invented. Purely on a sensory experience, VR could surpass it. I've had some pretty incredible VR experiences. There's a game like The Cubicle, I think, which is basically just a tech demo. If you're in your living room with your Vive Pro walking around, you're like, whoa, but it lacks this huge element, which is you're not experiencing it with a crowd. And I think that there's just such a big element to feeling the reaction sweep across the room in a movie theater collectively that when I asked myself the medium I wanted to work in, I said, yeah, of course I want to make motion pictures. I think this is the gold standard of our age. Now, I've had some other thoughts on that over the years. It's a fact that people just put something on while they're doing other tasks. An old man on the bus the other day said to me, he's worked in Hollywood for 60 years, and he said that everything is now TV unless it plays in a movie theater. There really aren't like nothing Netflix makes is a movie, even if it's 2 hours long. It has the aesthetic sensibilities of television, and that it's meant for somebody to put on and then like get distracted and go around and do other things. I actually am a believer in phone content because I think putting your art on someone's phone is the only way to get them to not be on their phone while they're experiencing it. And there's actually like a big value to that. So I'm like pro phone content, but it's not like movies, it's something else, you know? And as for the actual Hollywood pipeline, it's really bad right now. It's very sclerotic. It's very corrupt. It's contracting. It's not relevant. It's only a little better than traditional publishing, which is also abysmal. I don't think I would recommend for any young person to go into Hollywood right now. And I certainly don't get the majority of my creative fulfillment from Hollywood. You know, we were talking about my short film Red Team. Yeah, like I'm in Hollywood. I've been paid to write on Hollywood projects. I've worked for the studios. I live in LA. Like, by the facts, it seems like I am part of the system, but Red Team was not made within the Hollywood system, nor would Hollywood ever have made it. You know, I'm almost just like in the shadow of this big machine, cobbling things together with like parts that are left on the side of the alley. And I prefer that, you know, because you lose too much trying to sell out to the system as it is now. And I think as long as that's the case, it will continue to lose its relevance, and it may die. We've been in this position before. We were in this position in the late 60s, and obviously New Hollywood was this massive revitalization, this sort of second wind. But the difference is, in the New Hollywood days, there wasn't nearly as much foreign competition. Other countries are just eating our lunch. People love Korean dramas. People love stuff from all over the world. And it's cheaper to make over there. And even movies that on paper are American, you know, Alien Romulus was like made in Budapest, Hungarian crew. All that's left is like a couple people at the top, you know, and it's like, is that really an American movie at that point? So I'm very bearish, but it still is. That's the paradox of it. It's at once a disaster and the best, most impactful form that we have. You know, I mean, like Barbie and Oppenheimer completely swept across American culture. A book could never have done that. A TikTok could never have done that.
Do you see anything replacing the Hollywood film as this collective experience of mass media? Or do you think it'll just be like people spending more time on their phones?
I think that there are a lot of problems with the theatrical experience that make it not very desirable for people. I think people going on their phones in a theater is a big problem. This is a solvable problem. Alamo Drafthouse doesn't have this problem because they are very strict about kicking people out if they go on their phone. They have like a one strike policy. But as Lee Kuan Yew says, like, you need that iron in you to enforce something like that. And if the big chains are not actually going to be tough enough to like kick out people who are like texting and stuff, like that's a degraded experience. People don't want to go to that. You also have an economic problem where you can enter a death spiral because you have a fixed cost to make and exhibit the movie, and then you need to recoup that on tickets. So like the higher theater attendance is as a fraction of the American population, the lower you can price your tickets. A full theater is going to be a lot more profitable than a theater with 20 people sitting in it. You know what I mean? Because all the costs are fixed. But if fewer and fewer people are going to the movies, you basically need those viewers individually to take on a higher and higher percentage of the cost of the film, which leads to higher ticket prices, more expensive popcorn, and you're like killing the golden goose because you're training people to not go to the theater, especially when the theatrical window is so short, meaning just a month or two later it's going to be out on streaming. Why would you go to the theater? They've essentially trained people, and a lot of people have written about this. They've essentially trained people in a few ways not to go to the theater, and you end up in this sort of disaster. However, the like enormous capex that goes into multiplexes is also like very front loaded. You spend like $250,000 on like an IMAX projector, and it's laser, and then it's just there, and it can run. You know, it's solid state. It doesn't take film. It doesn't wear down. It could probably run for 10 or 15 years before you have to replace it. So something needs to fill those screens. So I think you've got a few options. Either movies will start just being made cheaper they'll just train the audience to go see a movie that doesn't look as good as in the past, which we already kind of did. I mean, you look at something like Ben-Hur, where they like build a real Roman hippodrome and they have like a real chariot race with like 10,000 extras and like horses getting killed. Like compare that to something like The Lord of the Rings, where you're like animating orcs with like CGI. Like obviously making Ben-Hur today with real people, like the cost would be like an order of magnitude higher than CGI. But we just trained people to not expect that and to still be okay with going to the movie as long as they have a good emotional experience. So that might happen, especially with AI, where we just train people to accept a certain amount of slop in their movie. We also might start exhibiting other things in movie theaters, like Taylor Swift concerts, which we already do, and those are huge experiences, or old movies, or foreign films. Like the theatrical experience will remain, but this experience of like having a whole, you look at like famously, whatever year the movie The Thing came out, 1985, you look at the marquee from 1985 on a given night, and it's just like all bangers. You're like, whoa, all those great movies were in theaters at the same time. And now it's like, okay, maybe one or two a year. I think it'll just continue in that direction.
Well, I think that's a pretty good time to wrap things up. As a final note, I want to give you an opportunity to plug anything you would like to plug. And we'd also like to know a short story that you would like to recommend, if possible.
Sure. So, plug. If you go to cairosmith.com, that's my name, you can see everything I'm working on. I try to keep it pretty minimal, just a collection of hyperlinks in that grand tradition of Web 1.0. So you can see my books there. You can find them in paperback. You can find them in Kindle. They seem to be pretty well liked. So if you liked what you heard and you want to get to know me better, read one of those. You can also see Red Team for free on YouTube. You can find it on the Futurist Letters website where I'm editor-in-chief. You can also watch my feature film Screwdriver, which is a psychological thriller, on Amazon. So that's all that. And then I've got a newsletter, which you can find all through my website, the Ascari Productions newsletter. That's also through Substack, just to keep abreast of what we're up to. So yeah, between all that and then I guess Cairo A. Smith on Twitter, aka X, where occasionally I blow up for just the dumbest things, and Substack notes as well. But yeah, and then as far as a short story, I'm tempted to just like plug one from Futurist Letters, but I would say my favorite short story is probably The Yellow Wallpaper, which is I think it's one you have to read in high school. So it's a little like saying like Gatsby for a novel, but I mean, I'm not gonna like pretend like the Lego movie's not a 5-star. You know what I mean? Like if it's my favorite, it's my favorite. So yeah, The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Just a creepy little story. I read it to some guys who were on mushrooms on a camping trip years ago, which was not very cool. I don't know why I do that to people, but good creepy story. And yeah, if you want to read more of my picks, subscribe to Futurist Letters as well.
All right, thanks so much for coming on, and we will see you all next week.
Welcome back. So, any thoughts on the episode, Kevin?
Yeah, so this episode was probably, I think, my favorite one to record from like a personal enjoyment perspective. I think there were a lot of things that we were able to talk about that we're interested in, but not always able to talk with other people. You know, things like Vibecamp and generally weird things on the internet. So that was pretty cool. But one thing we didn't get to talk about quite as much during the episode is Cairo Smith's actual novels, particularly Komodo and Current Affairs, which Gordon read both of and presumably still wants to talk about. So I was wondering, Gordon, if you could give a brief synopsis of Komodo and Current Affairs.
So, Komodo is the only one of these books that I would
classify as like traditional sci-fi, I guess. And it starts with a woman who gets kind of fired from a police force on this planet and like sets up a security freelancer startup that eventually turns into fascist paranoid organization that like grows in power to rival the government. And it's sort of like a story of this rise to power of like this hegemonic figure, I guess. And it was a solid story. Didn't pull punches. Would recommend. And then current affairs was it was like it was about a young dude who graduates college and moves to New York City, and kind of just like his life and relationships and stuff over the course of 5-6 years. It's pretty like romantic novel, I guess, kind of modernist. I feel like the books I want to compare it to are all books that are like I haven't read. I'm like in my head it's like sort of a cross between like The Sun Also Rises and Catcher in the Rye. Like these feel like books that's similar to. I haven't read either of his books. I don't know if I'm off base completely on that, but definitely very different type of book though. Like not sci-fi, like definitely just literary fiction book, but also very enjoyable read. I was really impressed by how different all three of these books were. I think it's pretty rare to have like a not super well known author who's willing to just be writing a bunch of different books in like different directions.
So, because these books were so different, like, what were you expecting from the episode going in? Was it kind of how you thought, or not really?
I think I had sort of. I mean, I've like listened to his podcast before and stuff, so I
Fair
guess
enough.
like I sort of had some sense of what to expect. Yeah, I mean, I get the sense that he was kind of happy to have like uh he really kind of wrote Scenebux like mainly about like these internet creatures he was aware of that like doesn't actually like know well in real life, and I think I got the sense it was kind of fun for him to talk to us. Or like act like I don't know. Eventually, like we actually went to Vibecamp and shit. He was like, "Whoa, the internet creatures, they're here."
I also read Komodo, but not Current Affairs. I think Cairo Smith is pretty similar to how I expect him to be as well. I guess reading Scenebux, I kind of got the sense that he was a weirdly similar guy to me in some ways, and I don't think that ended up being like 100% true. Like he wasn't like that similar to me, but there was definitely some stuff where I was kind of just like. So I also read Komodo. I did not read Current Affairs, but I read Komodo, and I would say that the main thing that's unique about Komodo is that it's kind of like a sci-fi novel and then also a Bay Area tech novel. Like the main character is just trying to raise like venture capital for their startup, and that's like the main action of the beginning of the book. And there's even stuff around like having control over the board and stuff like that, except the startup in question is just like a galactic paramilitary. And this was kind of interesting to encounter in this context. I mean, I don't really think it was based on any founder in particular, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was. Another thing that was interesting, and I don't know if this is like intentional or unintentional, but I think in the first half of the book especially, it evokes like a kind of strange sensation of time. Like
Yeah.
I feel like time kind of just like passes and you're just like, whoa. Like it's very like I don't even know how to describe it, but you kind of
Yeah,
just
there
feel like
were. It was
you're
kind of
somewhere
jarring
and then you're like
sometimes.
somewhere.
Yeah, because it'd be like one paragraph was somewhere, and then like okay, maybe there would be like one of those like three triangle like little breaks type of things, but then it would be like just like talking about like a different place or something, or go into some other conversation, and like 6 months would have passed, and you'd have to kind of figure out from context like that time was passing or that something happened, and honestly, I found this kind of confusing. At times, I think it was cool, but I think it was probably not worth it. But it did have momentum. Like I guess it did feel like a story that could have really gotten like bogged down in like taking forever. as it like grew and grew and grew, it just like grew very quickly in terms of pages, and it felt sort of natural.
Yeah, I mean, I think with both Komodo and Scenebux, like, he kind of just let it rip. You know, like they kind of just like were just going. I was like, whoa, this book's over already. The plot just kind of kept going. You know, very quickly. Like I just felt like it was kind of just done in no time at all.
I think Scenebux had a lot more momentum though.
Oh.
Like Scenebux was one of the most like high energy kind of frantic books I've ever read. Like I don't know, it was kind of insane at times. Like, it was like bam, 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 bam. Kevin, what were your thoughts on Scenebux?
I thought Scenebux was one of the first times where I really saw myself in a book. I think that it's supposed to be a sort of formative event. Is you're supposed to see yourself in a book. There's like this Carlos Bulo song quote where he's like, "When was the first time you read a book and you saw yours in it?" I think when I was a kid, I had this experience like a few times. Sometimes I would like read myself in a book, and I remember this was a thing they would harp on for like people who are like not white. Is like one of the main reasons you want to have books written by like non-white people, so people who are not white can also have this like core formative experience of like reading a book and just be like, yo, that's me in a book. But I feel like once I hit a certain age, this stopped happening because I just became too whack as a result of exposure to online brainworms. And I would read a book from the 1970s and I would be like, wow, I did not see myself in that book. That guy is not similar to me at all. And I feel like I kind of just resigned myself to the fact that that phase of my life was over and I was like not going to see myself in a book. But then I read Scenebux and I was like, you know what? This dude isn't exactly like me, but I sort of feel like I saw myself in a book. And this was kind of a novel experience. And I'm grateful to have had. So that's what I thought about that book.
I did not have that thought. Or, well, no, I sort of did have that thought. Like, I sort of saw you in this book as well. I did not see myself in the book. I did see a bunch of stuff that I have interacted with come across that I've never seen in a book before, though, which was pretty cool. Like, I mean, we mentioned in the podcast, Vibecamp was like literally there, which we went to. But just like the way like different groups of internet people were mentioned that I haven't seen show up in fiction ever before, and it was pretty cool. There's like this one part at the end of the book where he just like kind of like shits out this like super long list of names of just like everyone who's referenced in this book. It's like a really impressive list. It's like a lot of people. And I was just like, wow, it's like crazy how many of these people I know. I think there's a good chance just like more than 50% of like people whose names I recognize were referenced in Scenebux, to be honest. like how many people do I know? I don't know. I do like probably like 200 to 300 names from the list at the end of that book. Like, do I know like 500 people? I don't know. Maybe you said it right. So that's about like half or so. It's not like I know like a ridiculous amount of people. To be clear, not like know personally, just like, you know, recognize the name, sort of like know who they are or whatever. And that was very cool, especially because like 90% of these people were just, maybe not 90%, like, you know, like half of these people were just people I would not particularly famous and would like never expect to be referenced in a book. But also, this book was just I don't know, I guess like the genre for this book is like probably thriller, right? If you were to put it in a genre.
I'd say it's
sounds
like
a bit weird to say, but I sort of think it's thriller, I guess. The book was very thrilling, I thought. It was just like impressive, the level of energy. What was really impressive was like the density of things happening combined with like the amount of time spent on inner monologue. Like I think normally books where like that are just like event often have like they're more like a movie, like where like the main character's like inner thoughts and voice are like less of the focus, right? Because it's just
Yeah,
like
like
always
Death End.
describing like there's yeah, it's like always like the shit. There's just like a million things happening. But this book was not that. Like we were like in this dude's head a lot in this book. You know, we were getting like all his reactions to everything, all his thoughts and stuff. But it was still really energetic. I don't know. I guess I hadn't really thought about that before, but that was pretty cool. I think that was impressive. Like the extent to which it was, yeah, both very personal and energetic. I do think it was able to do this somewhat because we were very specifically in one dude's head and not anyone else's head. But I think it was pretty cool.
I don't remember if we talked about this on the pod, but what is Vibecamp, Gordon?
It is a summer camp for adults in the woods in Maryland that sort of evolved out of a Twitter community that were people that kind of like generally agreed with like most of the basic tenets of like rationalism, I guess, and we're former rationalists for the most part, but thought the vibes were bad in rationalism. And we're gonna have kind of similar ideas, we're gonna have good vibes rather than kind of like cold and dispassionate and be like very friendly and sunny and stuff, but still have similar values. And this community was like, to do this, to kind of like make a thing for this community, we should just like all go to the woods and vibe. And thus Vibecamp was born and did things like dance parties and talk about smells and yes, get waterboarded. Vibe activities. But yeah, actually legitimately getting waterboarded was very fun. One of the highlights of Vibecamp for sure for me.
Why was getting waterboarded fun?
I think modernity kind of lacks ways in which you can like be heroic. I think to like live in today's world, it's just hard to be heroic and feel heroic in a lot of situations. And I think on some level, the experience of resisting being waterboarded feels very heroic. So to be clear, the setup is for Vibecamp. There's these events that are listed, and someone listed as an event like consensual waterboarding, and me and Kevin and friend of the pod Merrick, who was with us as well, were like, sure, let's do it. There was kind of a big crowd in the corner of the pool. They had like a few people on sort of like beach chairs. You would lie down. They had towels and would kind of like cover your mouth and nose and stuff and like pour water on you. And a bunch of people around would just like cheer and stuff. And you know, you could tap out at any point. No one was actually being tortured or anything. But it felt like you were drowning. It was distinctly uncomfortable. But it also did feel like, I don't know, the first time I did it, I kind of locked in. I did it for a long time, and it felt like a good sense of accomplishment, and it did feel kind of heroic in some way. And I think it was a pretty good feeling, and so I did it again. Like the next time, I like really cooked, and that felt pretty good.
I'm actually thinking about how waterboarding as an event is like very reflective of Vibecamp as an event in more ways than one. Like, if you're imagining waterboarding, like, what's the vibe, right? Terrible, bad, awful. You're in like a dark cellar with a CIA agent who wants to know what kind of state secrets you're hiding. It's not good. It's not a good vibe. Waterboarding at Vibecamp, very good vibe. One of the best vibes I've ever experienced, to be honest. Essentially, like, at the very beginning, like, if you're just walking in to this waterboarding situation, you would think that you're about to witness some, like, I don't know, like, exciting event, like, positive, exciting event, which I guess you could say that it is, but like there's basically this big ring of enthusiastic people that were cheering by the poolside, and you're just like, wow, I wonder what they're doing inside of that ring of people. And like as you get closer, people are getting like more excited and more loud. And then you just like push your way all the way to the front, and then you just have like 3 beach chairs. People are just like lying down on them with the cloths over their face, twitching, just like holy shit. But then everyone is just like, yeah, waterboarding, yeah. And then the cloth will come off with the person's face. They're just like, waterboarding, yeah. And you're just like, wow, I guess this really is a good vibe. I mean, honestly, I think I would have been, like, I was obviously still a bit apprehensive about getting waterboarded. I might have noped out if the vibe was, like, bad. You know, like,
Oh,
if I'm
yeah,
imagining, like,
same.
the exact same experience, right? But if it's just kind of in this, like, dingy cellar where, like, kind of just, like, water, but, like, you know, because it had this great poolside vibe, it was like, you know what? Maybe I'll try this thing that most people would think is insane. And I think that was the vibe of Vibecamp. The vibe was so good that you were like, you know what? Maybe I will try this thing that most people would think is kind of insane. And it was kind of insane. And I did actually get sick. And so I would say on the whole, it was maybe not fantastic, but it was a pretty good story. Also, I would say a highlight of the event was towards the point of the waterboarding, there was this guy that pulled up with a shirt that said, no non-consensual waterboarding. I don't know, like, how he had the idea for this shirt, where he got it. It seemed like it would have had to have been custom. I don't know if it was his idea, if he just saw the event on the schedule and was like, wow, I need to make a custom shirt. Who knows what goes on in the minds of the average vibe camper. But anyway, he pulls up and people just start cheering. Like, they start going wild. It's just like, holy shit, this guy is so committed to the bit. He has a custom shirt. When it's turn to go up, he just raises the hand in the air and he's just like, I consent. And everyone just like screams. It's like he said, like, I'm Spartacus or something. And then he just like, they put him down on the beach chair and he just takes like a whole fucking bottle of water, just like without flinching. And then he gets up and like people are cheering. And then there's like people just like take a picture of him with all of the people that have just waterboarded him, and it's all smiles. And like when I saw that picture being taken, I was like, wow, that is very Vibecamp. And I probably would not be able to explain that to anyone without this lore dump that I gave you right here.
And to be clear, like average person at the water burning event was like us pretty much. Like it wasn't a bunch of like enthusiastic people into waterboarding, and we like kind of show up and are like, whoa, this is like a good vibe. Like I guess we'll do. No, it was kind of like what was like, you know, sort of apprehensive, but like, I guess I'll give it a shot. But just had good energy, and then like eventually everyone kind of came together, and it made it a good vibe. And that's like sort of generally how things were. Like I think things were definitely very collectively weird at Vibecamp, and obviously there were a lot of weird people, but I think honestly people were more normal than I was expecting. Like I was expecting people there to be really weird. I don't think they were very much weirder than the average, but they were like really, really weird people for the most part. Like there were definitely times I was like surprised by how normal someone seemed. I was like, how did they end up here? And then I was like, how did I end up here? Like, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think subcultures are weird like that, right? Like, there are things in subcultures that are more dependent on like your engagement with them, right? But I think that Vibecamp was something where you could just kind of find out about it and just end up there. Like there wasn't really much reason not to. It was like publicly advertised on Twitter. So if your Twitter algorithm was twittering enough, then I could see it. It's been really interesting to see how like the rationalist community and the post-rationalist community and such have like touched other parts of the culture as they've gotten more prominent. I feel like it's been kind of linear, maybe not linear, but like I feel like every year it's kind of become more of a thing. I don't know if you would say the same, like people being aware of it. Like maybe this is mostly just because of like AI and stuff, but I feel like now this is just kind of a thing I can mention more. Like in Seattle at least. Well, like I'd have to. There might be some explaining to do, but before I would kind of just be like, you know, like you have the big inhale before your lore drop. I don't really feel that way anymore.
So there's this short story slash potentially novella, I guess, that you've been working on and started writing. Want to talk a little bit about how that's been going?
Yeah, so I've been sitting on this story idea for a very long time. I would say since like the first season of this magazine almost. It's just been there. It's gone through many forms, but The problem is that it just always felt a little bit too long and unwieldy to actually write. I was really hoping that I could squeeze a short story out of it. But I kind of am at the point where I'm like, you know what? I just got to write the thing, and it might be a novel. And if it's a novel, it's a novel. But I finally committed to writing the story, and so that's definitely been a good feeling. So it may be available to people shortly, at least in like its in uncompleted serialized form. But to describe the novel in broad strokes is that it's about this like bubble world, I guess you could say, that's floating in like this cosmic soup. And the people in this bubble think that they're the only people in the universe. But then there's this other bubble world that descends into their worlds and becomes this sort of holy site. And this smaller bubble world contains alien artifacts that are being deciphered by this other culture. And it also gives people terrifying visions of the apocalypse. Now, most people see these terrifying visions of the apocalypse and they think it's a warning and that the civilization should do everything in its power to prevent this from coming to pass. But there are other people who actually interpret it as more of a blessing, and they think it's actually God's will that their world should ascend into the heavens and be devoured. And this ends up becoming their founding mission. So there's basically this weird religious cult that gets founded, and like a more sane, rational religion that gets started around the same time as a result of the arrival of this alien object. And most of the story centers around this guy who's in this cult, I guess you could say, and him trying to reckon with what he's done and how he should balance his religious ideals with what he thinks is right and the people he cares about.
Definitely excited to see where the story ends up going. We've talked about such very different versions of this story that it's kind of insane that it's like the same idea throughout. I think like pretty much the emotional structure of the story has stayed pretty much the same, but I think pretty much like because this story was originally like kind of taking place on the ocean, and it was like the most original version of
Like
the
a normal
story
island.
I remember it was like a normal island, and the dude like committed a crime that was kind of bad, and was undecided and got exiled, and then had to leave the island. And this is like so alien from where it is now, but
there's a
somehow
fear.
it is the same thread. It is the same thread. Yeah, are you happy with where it's gone?
I think I'm pretty happy with where it's gone. I mean, there's things about the very original that I like a lot. I mean, what I liked about the original is that it's very simple. Like, there's really not much going on to think about besides the main message of the story. And there is something to that. Like, there's not very many moving parts. It's just kind of this guy on his voyage to the edge of the world, and he's just sailing. And I kind of liked it being in, like, some kind of vague ancient human past. Like, that was sort of cool, too. But I do feel like the version of the story that currently exists is a lot more on brand for me specifically, and it's cool to write something that you feel like only you really could have written. That's always kind of cool.
Yeah, like I do agree. There's an attractiveness to the simplicity, but like on some level that doesn't really, feel like your type of thing, I guess.
Yeah,
like yeah.
yeah. I mean, the setting was actually pretty inspired by the first article I ever wrote for Synthesized Sunsets, the original version, like the Wandering Inn one.
Or the one with like
the last tide. The last tide. Yeah, that was kind of more the vibe. Whereas this one doesn't really have that vibe as much.
Yeah.
So I kind of do like the idea of sailing to the edge of the world, but the reason that it felt like weird is like I couldn't figure out a way for this dude to truly be the first person to like go beyond the world in a way that wasn't like totally weird and like the more I thought about it, the more I was like, okay, this doesn't make any fucking sense. If you can just like sail out to the edge of the world in like a boat, like surely someone would have done. And like a lot of this was just me being like, how could I make this like not be whack that this guy is like a pioneer to the edge of the world? And then it just kept getting like more and more insane. But I think I'm pretty happy with the with finally cracking this problem.
Well, I think that's a pretty good time to wrap things up. So, do you have any short story recommendations for us, Kevin?
So I was looking through some of the Hugo Award hopefuls for short stories and novellas over these past couple months. And I wouldn't say that I read any knockouts necessarily, but one that I did think was pretty good and seems to be pretty well liked is a story called Landline by Kelly Robson, which is horror. I guess what I don't like it is that it's really just horror. I don't think it's trying to be anything else. But it's a pretty good horror story. I was hooked. It's basically about this woman who's at the airport, and then she gets this call from her from her son who's at home and is like in trouble, and she has to like figure out how to help him.
That's a good setup for a story. Like,
Yeah,
you are able to impact the situation, but like not nearly as much as you would like to be able to. Or yeah, I feel like there's something where it's like if you can't impact a situation at all, it's like not quite as scary. And if you're like right there and like fully able to act as you normally could, it's not as scary. Like it has to be somewhere in the middle for like maximum fear.
and I like the situation being mediated through the phone too. Like you can't really tell what's going on because all you know is from her POV, like what is coming through the phone. You're just like, oh shit, oh fuck.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was pretty good.
Yeah, it does sound good. I'll give it a read for sure. All right. Well, thanks for listening, and we'll see you all in the next couple weeks.